Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold.
I love that poem by John Keats. I think it speaks to the value of libraries and how wonderful it is that all of us have the privilege of going to our library and then going anywhere in the world we want to go, in any time period that we want to be, and meet people we certainly couldn't have met any other way. That's the value of libraries. And that's the reason I'm so pleased to be here with you again, to work with a great staff at Concordia Parish Public Library and Director Amanda Taylor in presenting these programs to you each month. I also thank Delta Bank, because Delta Bank is one of our sponsors for this and makes all these programs possible. Hello everyone. Today we get to explore the life and times of someone most of you will have heard of, but many of you will not know anything really about. I like these programs when we get to explore folks who have something interesting going on in their lives, but not the whole world after a few years figures out exactly what's going on with them. Our person today is known as Coco. She's Coco Chanel, and she was quite the woman. This is her logo, the interlocking C's, which everyone assumes, okay, that stands for Coco Chanel. Well, maybe, and maybe not. It's an iconic logo. I did some research into it. I recognize it instantly because I'm a woman of the age who remembers the influence that Coco Chanel had. I also am a woman who has experience in marketing and branding and public relations. And so I was wondering just how iconic is this logo? I discovered, as of the time we're taping this particular program, that according to a group of PR and marketing people, branding specialists, this logo is the second most recognized logo in the world for a product. She was beaten by Nike's Swish, but she's still number 2, which is pretty amazing. She first used this logo when she developed her equally iconic perfume, the Chanel No. 5. And it's been a puzzle for a lot of people. You know, most people just assume, okay, it's CC, that's Coco Chanel, that's why she did it. Well, there were some influences on Coco as to what her logo should look like. I picked just a few for you all to go over with me because I think they're the most interesting. One, it bears a striking resemblance to a 4,000-year-old Indo-European symbol of good luck, which is also known as the swastika. And it was adopted, of course, by the German National Socialists in 1920 when Coco's career was really beginning to take off. This is a picture of the old swastika before it had been sort of captured by the Nazis. This is one that's in the Kiev Museum. It's a Grecian one, as I said. And during the Bronze Age, the swastika became very widespread, used as a pattern throughout Europe. Today, the emblem is called the Greek key pattern, as opposed to the swastika because of the connections that are unpleasant with the Nazi emblem. There's another one that was a possible influence for this particular logo. In the 16th century, Catherine de' Medici used an almost identical emblem for her identifying logo. Got a picture of it here. It shows the interlocking C's for Catherine. And it was her, as a French queen, it was her insignia or her logo. Here it's carved as part of an ornate fireplace mantle at one of her chateaux, the Chateau de Chenonceau. Jim and I have seen it. It's beautiful. Then we look at Coco's life and we discover there's a similar motif of entwined half circles in the Arthur Capel Cup. It's a silver polo trophy and it's presented by the Paris Polo Club. And it was donated by Arthur Boy Capel's sister as a memorial after he died. He was quite well known as a polo player. He was a playboy and did polo and had lots of girlfriends, including Coco. And Coco Chanel more than likely paid for this trophy. And then some scholars are convinced that though she never married, that Coco Chanel's true love was Boy Capel. We'll take a look at him a little bit later. There's another possible connection for where that CC, that logo, came from, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I'm going to make you wait on that one. Let's first take a look at that perfume. Chanel hoped that its number name, number 5, and the very minimalist bottle's shape would resonate with women all over the world, regardless of whether they were European or American or whatever. And she bet right. That Chanel bottle is an icon today. If you see it, and it doesn't even have the label on it, people who know Chanel products and know Chanel number 5 recognize that bottle. The other perfume bottles at the time that she brought out her perfume were very ostentatious. They were, they had lots of crystal on them, and they were really kind of messy. They weren't simple and elegant. She liked the shape of a whiskey flask with a little stopper bottle, and she decided that's what her perfume should be in. You know, she was an interesting character. She's known as a fashionista. Most people either know her perfume or they know her classic clothing. But I'll guarantee you, most of you, like me, won't have realized what an impact she had on women's fashion in terms of taking us out of the very uncomfortable clothes that men designers thought we should wear and move us into very comfortable, beautiful clothes that allowed us to do and be. That business with that wine, the whiskey flask for the design for her perfume, one of the reasons that works so well is it because it brings into the world of women the world of men. And she did that many, many, many times as she developed what would become known as the modern woman's couture. This is an interesting quote from Town and Country magazine. It says, after coming up with the idea to create a perfume for her fashion brand during a meeting with friends in Monte Carlo, Chanel reached out to master perfumer Ernest Beau. She wanted the scent to be one of a kind, and she wanted it to resemble her style and her personality. Her goal was for it to reflect the sensuality and complexity of the modern woman. And mind you, she's defining the modern woman before the modern woman exists. The result is a seductive, multifaceted floral unlike any other perfume on the market, and it is unique. Ernest Beau, it's interesting to know about him. She selected him, and it was a very calculated selection because he had been the former perfumer for the Russian czars. So this is the top of the line fellow to develop a fragrance. It took him a couple of months to create the fragrance that she wanted. And when he was ready, he had 10 samples for her. The first was set 1 through 5. The second sets 20 through 24. She tested them all, but she picked the number 5 out of the first set. The legend is that number 5 was actually the result of a laboratory accident when the chemist who was putting together the parts to make this wonderful fragrance put an unusually high dose of something called an aldehyde into the sample. Now, aldehydes, you'll have a little bit of chemistry while we talk about Chanel number 5. Aldehydes are chemical substances, and they're derived from plants, and they're made with alcohol. They're called today in our market, in our life, essential oils. Back then, they were called aldehydes, and nobody knew quite what to do with them, except the folks who were developing the perfumes recognized that they were extremely important in order to hold the fragrance. Aldehydes had been discovered in 1835 by a German chemist, and so they're still relatively new, and of course the whole point of making a perfume that's your own perfume is that its formula remains secret. So Chanel number 5, even to this day, does not list the aldehydes that are used in their formula. And that formula has been a complete, total secret for 102 years and counting. Chanel as a person, as a woman, particularly as an adult, wanted and loved the finest of everything. And so to create her perfume, she spared no expense. It takes 1 ton of flowers to produce 1.5 kilograms of the absolute. Now, absolute, another little chemical term for you. They're very similar to the essential oils, but they have more oil content. So they have more lasting power on the woman's skin. They're concentrated, they're highly aromatic, and they're also a plant extraction. At the heart of number 5 are some ingredients that are extremely expensive. Lang Lang is a particular part of it. It's a flower, and it's harvested in Madagascar and Mayotte. Then the May rose is in it, and it only blooms flowers 3 weeks every year, so you have to go get it. And then jasmine from Grasse. That was probably the biggest expense for her because that particular jasmine is the most luxurious raw ingredient to be found in the world. It's located on the French Riviera, which is one of Chanel's favorite places. And 2 pounds of it sells for just over $60,000 today. Why did Chanel name it number 5? Couple of reasons. Some scholars say that she picked the 5th sample Beau sent to her, and that's the reason. It just was the 5th sample. Others say no, there was more to it, because for Chanel, number 5 was one of her favorite numbers that brought her good luck. She was very superstitious, extremely superstitious. And so she was obsessed with numbers and numerology and astrology. She was born under the sign of Leo, the lion. And so the lion became a recurring motif for her in her work, and the number 5 held a special resonance for her as well. In 1921, she was speaking with Ernest Beau, the perfumer who created number 5 for her. And she said, quote, "I present my dress collections on the 5th of May, the 5th month of the year. And so we will let this sample number 5 keep its name it has already. It will bring good luck." And it set her up for life. Chanel number 5 was incredibly successful. The revenue from it did secure her financially for life. You know, clothing fashions come and go, but a perfume, if it's particularly wonderful, is going to last. And so this perfume has marked its own space in the world of international fragrances. This is another fun quote from Town & Country magazine. From Marilyn Monroe saying a few drops of Chanel No. 5 was all she wore to bed, to Andy Warhol's silk screens of the bottle. Its popularity is unparalleled. It was the first perfume that was embraced in the modern advertising world. Even when Paris was liberated, there were endless lines of American soldiers there waiting to get samples of Chanel No. 5 to bring home to their wives and their sweethearts. This picture of Marilyn putting a little dab of Chanel No. 5, that's one of the early advertisements that they had for the perfume. I think you can probably see why the perfume was very popular both with the women and with the men. And then the other picture that you have are 4 of the silk screens that Warhol did. He had a way of taking the very common and making it real art. And the bottle was such a unique shape for bottles at that time that he did that as well. I personally prefer his Chanel silk screens to his Campbell Soup silk screens. Chanel said, "Perfume is the unseen but unforgettable ultimate fashion accessory. It heralds a woman's arrival and prolongs her departure." This is a picture of Chanel in her own advertisement for her perfume. And this is the first picture of Chanel that I've allowed you to see. And the reason for that is I'm sure that more of you would recognize the Chanel No. 5 perfume bottle than you would any picture of Chanel herself. The fact that she allowed herself to be part of the advertising is part of her brand building, and she did a terrific job with it. One of the interesting things about Chanel, among many, was that when people would come to visit her at her, what we would call store, but back then it was more like her studio. When they would go to have a meeting with her, it had a grand staircase in it. And she had it fixed so that when someone was just about to enter her presence, there would be a little poof of Chanel No. 5 in the air, so that you knew where you were and you were reminded that this Chanel was the inventor of Chanel No. 5. Coco Chanel said, "You can be gorgeous at 30, charming at 40, and irresistible for the rest of your life." And that's how she lived her life. This picture of her is one of my favorites because, first of all, she's nearly 60 and she's held together pretty well. You notice she's doing all right. And she's wearing her own outfit. She has dressed herself in things that she has designed herself: hat, clothing, and jewelry. A lot of people don't realize that Coco Chanel was the person who made costume jewelry reality. We wear it all the time, but when she was in her early years and developing her fashion look, she realized that women who couldn't afford great jewels still needed to feel special. One of the things that she developed, you see here, it's a wide cuff bracelet. And what you probably won't be able to tell from the picture, the large stone emblem that's on that cuff is a variation of the swastika. This particular one, this wide cuff look, was all hers, and she made them so that women could wear them singly, or a woman could wear on one and the other. And when she had them both on, Chanel said, "You'd better watch out." She was ready for a fight. She has pearls. She was known for pearls. She loved pearls. She has 2 brooches in this picture that you'll see, and also a large brooch on her hat, and large earrings. Now, what I'm here to tell you is some of that is beautiful, expensive, exquisite, serious stones. Some of it is purely costume. It's paste, as we would say. She mixed them. She always mixed them. And she loved it when people would look at something that was particularly beautiful and think that it was real, and it wasn't. And then at other times they would look at something that was just exquisite, perfectly beautiful, probably a pretty large stone, and they would assume it was fake, and it wasn't. So she's quite a cat with her jewelry. Her jewelry spoke as much about her as her clothing did. Now we get to who is Coco Chanel? Who was she? Was she born into a wealthy, high society family? Most people assume yes. Was her childhood one of freedom and filled with love? Most people would say, well, sure. Was her education at the finest schools of her day? People would assume, well, of course. Was her love life joyous, adventurous? Most people would say, absolutely. And then did she have children? Well, they wouldn't be sure because they wouldn't really know that much about her private life. What I want you to know is the answer to every one of these is no, except one. And we shall explore and find out which one it is. Full disclosure here, I knew about her when I was growing up. I knew about her perfume, I recognized her logo, I understood her fashion. I knew that there were a couple of things associated with her besides the perfume. One, the pearls, the other, the little black dress. Sort of everybody when I was growing up, when you were going to something that was particularly nice, the women, the girls, wanted to wear a perfectly simple little black dress. The thing is, though, that's all I knew about Coco Chanel. I really didn't know anything about her as a person. I have found 2 books, and they're the books that I want to recommend to you today if you would like to explore Coco Chanel's life in more detail after this taping. There are a lot of biographies. She had a habit of not telling anything, and then she would tell, this during her lifetime, or then she would talk to some people and would approve that they were gonna maybe try to write a biography of her, and then she would sue them when they decided that they were gonna print it. She was so personal. She was so guarded about who was the real Coco Chanel. Anyway, I have found 2 that I found particularly informative. Both of them kind of break through the walls that Chanel herself had put in place, and I recommend them to you. The first one is this Mademoiselle Coco Chanel and the Pulse of History. It's a fine, fine book that I think you would enjoy very much. It's pretty thick, you can see that. It was published by Rhonda Gerlich, and it came out in 2014, so it's a relatively new book. This is a picture of Dr. Gerlich. She received her bachelor's, her master's, and her doctorate in comparative literature and French from Yale, so she has the credentials. She's currently a fellow of the New York Institute for the Humanities, and she's also a Guggenheim Fellow. She was born in New York City, and she lives there today with her husband. What I want you to understand about her book is that it's going to be more from the scholarly perspective. And by this, I mean you're going to find footnotes, you're going to have lots of references, you're going to have details about correspondence and letters and historic events and so forth that you're not going to find in the second book. This is a more serious read because it's more detailed along the line that a fashion historian or a cultural historian would be interested in. The other book that I found is a rather beautiful book. It's this one. It's Coco Chanel, Revolutionary Woman. Kyra Johnson published this one on April the 6th, 2021. So it's brand new. And it was designed to come out to be in line with the 100th anniversary of Chanel's work. Kyra Johnson's book is a beautiful coffee table book. It's unlike the other one in that it focuses more on little known photographs of Chanel through her lifetime and her fashions. And so it's a special book, I think, for people who want to get the feel of Chanel, get a sense of the history of her work, but not go into as much details as perhaps a fashion follower would. Kyra's a journalist. She's an art history graduate. She writes about travel and art and lifestyle, and she also serves as a book editor. And as I told you before, she wanted this book to come out on the 100th anniversary of the release of Chanel No. 5. She's Italian, born in Milan, and was educated at the university there. To put Chanel's life in a historical context that we would identify with, when Chanel was born, the Statue of Liberty was being built in Paris as a gift to the United States. Most think of her talent as a fashion designer and a perfumer, but I found that her greatest gift was her gift to be able to tell a lie and stand by it until a better lie presented itself. She is one of the world's greatest liars, and there are some very, very tragic reasons why she developed that particular talent. She had such a miserable early part of her life that she had to create a false narrative about who she was and where she came from. And then she made changes into that story as situations warranted. Let's go back to those questions and look at those one by one. Was she born into a wealthy, high society family? No. This is a picture of Chanel working as a seamstress. She's probably 19 or 20 at the most at this. She was hardly of the highborn. This is a picture of her as a child, and she's beautiful. Look at those eyes. She was born Gabrielle Boyer Chanel. She was born in France, August 19th, 1883. Her father, Albert Chanel, was an alcoholic. He was a street vendor, and he peddled women's underwear. Her mother, Eugenie Jean Duval, was a laundress and a washerwoman, very poor, and the two never married. They lived in poverty. Most of the time, the mother was very ill. She had sort of a chronic lung thing. This is at a time when medicine is not primitive, but it's certainly not what we know today. And so certain illnesses were not understood. She may have been tubercular. They said, kind of probably a bronchitis maybe that wouldn't go away. Anyway, these children are fathered by this man who then goes off and sells women's underwear at different places, and the mother's left alone sick. So the children were very much left alone. Gabriella had 4 siblings who actually made it beyond childhood. Their mother died when Gabrielle was just 11. And in one of her interviews, when she dared to speak about the reality of her childhood, she said that her mother was so sick so much of the time that all the children could do, and her only memory of her mother, was they had to tiptoe around her very quietly so as not to disturb her, because when she was awake, she would have these terrible coughing fits. When the mother died, then the street vendor alcoholic father's got 4 kids he's got to do something with. And the first thing he does is he takes them to their grandparents and says, you have to take them back. And the grandparents said, no, they were poor too, and they couldn't take on more children. They had still children of their own. So the father's solution was to abandon his children. He took his sons, there were two of them, to farmers' homes and gave them away as free labor. The girls he placed in an orphanage. The orphanage was at Aubazine Monastery, which is in France. It's a 900-year-old French abbey where Gabrielle lived for 6 years. And these are her formative years. She goes in at 12, she comes out at 18. So her time of becoming an adult female, it's under the care and careful watch of the nuns at the monastery. Here was where she began kind of creating this fictional childhood to replace the one that she had actually experienced. And if you look carefully at her life, you see over and over and over again that sense of abandonment which she felt as a 12-year-old. That comes through loud and clear. I think it's part of the reason she was driven to do what she did, to be independent and make as much money as she could and all that. This was a good convent, one of the most respected in France. It had been the order had been founded in 1860 specifically to take care of children and the poor with a focus on orphan children. It was the largest orphanage in that district of France. The girl's grandmother, who wouldn't take the girls, did know the nuns there because she had worked as a laundress for the convent, and that helped, I think, a little bit for the move. You can see from the picture of the convent, of course, it's very old. It looks very French, as it should. And this was the place which Chanel would look at the rest of her life as either her prison or her salvation, depending on the mood that she was in at the moment. Before she even got to the convent, back in the days when father was gone somewhere and mother was sick, Gabrielle became obsessed with cemeteries. And that obsession stayed with her throughout her life, so much so she designed her own tombstone. She told several biographers through the years that when she was very, very young, she loved to play in the cemetery. She found two tombstones that she particularly liked. They're people she has no idea, she's never met them. And they became her best friends as a child. And she would visit those graves to play, and she would bring them little offerings and small gifts. She told one biographer, "I would return in secret to my tombs, bringing crumbs from a cake, a piece of fruit, poisonous mushrooms that I thought were pretty. I thought the dead appreciated my offerings, my love, my games. I still believe they protect me and bring me happiness. I was the queen of this secret garden. The dead are not dead as long as we think about them, I would tell myself." You get the picture? We have a very lonely child who has suffered the most extreme form of abandonment. And she's gone from a world where she had some form of limited freedom to a world where every move is controlled by the nuns who are training her and bringing her up. Okay, next question. Was her education at the finest schools of her day? No. It was at the monastery, of course. And the monastery was really not that different from the other schools of the time. It was designed to train the young girls for some marketable skill in case they couldn't make a good marriage. And the orphans just about never could. They had no hope of a dowry. They had no good family name. If they'd been abandoned like Mademoiselle Chanel, there's no hope for that. So they taught her how to sew, how to embroider, and how to iron. Those were the 3 skills that were considered necessary for a young woman who had to support herself once she reached age and could no longer stay in the orphanage. Again, before she ever went to the monastery, Chanel would make her own rag dolls. And she would tell the other little girls that she didn't like the bought dolls. She much preferred to create her own. So she did have a talent early on for sewing. One of the things that she remembered from the monastery that she loved especially was the beautiful music, the singing that would happen within the services. And she belonged to the choir at the monastery, so she developed some singing talent there too. She spent her entire adult life hiding her years in the convent. And virtually any truth about her early life. Still, the sisters there at the Abbey were important influences for her. The fact that her father abandoned her at the orphanage and never saw her again throughout the rest of his life. That abandonment, again, was such a theme for her, such a heart hurt for her, that it turned her into a go-getter. I'm going to make this work kind of person, rather than just crawling into a hole and sewing little things for people for the rest of her life. I told you that there were several possible influences for the Coco Chanel logo. One of them is the Abbey, where she was an orphan. On the ground floor of the chapter room, where the orphans would take their studies, there's a plain stained glass window. You can see it here. There are actually several of them. This is one. And the designs look very familiar to the interlocking rings and the interlocking C's of Coco Chanel's logo. She would have seen them every day for those years that she lived at the orphanage, and they would have been imprinted in her memory. The other influences, and these are ones, frankly, I hadn't thought about, but it makes perfect sense. The nuns were the first women in her whole life that Gabrielle had ever seen who basically were independent career women. They took orders from their boss, who was another woman, the Mother Superior. Very stark contrast to the women in her world. Here's her mother, who never marries this man, and ne'er-do-well, and just periodically has one of his children, but totally dependent on other people. These women, these nuns, gave her a view of life for a woman that she had not thought of before. And then the other influence for them, their clothing was, of course, black and white. And Chanel always used black, white, and beige as her signature colors. The next question, of course, is, was her love life joyous? I bet most of you think it was. Adventurous, joyous, lots of interesting, wealthy, men, all that. Actually, it wasn't. It was, in its way, as tragic as her childhood was. She said in a rare time when she commented on her years in the orphanage, or what she would call her childhood. She said, quote, "Without money, you are nothing. That with money, you can do anything. I would say to myself over and over, money is the key to freedom." She decided that she would try her luck as a cabaret singer. This is a poster of her. Well, it's not really of her, but it's a poster that's advertising one of the most popular songs of the day for the cabaret set. and it was one that she would sing. They would get these women who were very attractive, and they would have regular acts at the cabaret. But in between acts, they would have a woman or maybe a duet come out and sing something to entertain the crowd while they were preparing to do the next major act. And so she got to do that. She thought that she was sewing, she was doing her seamstress work, but that was not going to take her where the money was. There were moments of joy in her love life, but there was also always calculation. How could she get money and do it in such a way that she would be attractive? She knew that without a dowry, without a good family name, marrying well was just not in her future. That was not going to happen. So she decided on the next best thing. She decided that she would become the mistress to a very wealthy man, and ultimately a series of wealthy men. Each one had to be positioned socially and financially in such a way that they could provide for her the good life that she could never have gotten on her own. But they also had to be willing to support her business ambitions, because she was determined to make her own money. She had been accepted as a charity student at the Notre Dame School in Moulins, and that was so she could get more advanced seamstress instruction, sewing instruction. When she was 21, she started this singing business at the cabarets, and the reason that she did was because this was the way she could meet French cavalry officers, young men who offered a future. So this is her first step. And it was in the cabaret, as she's singing, that she gets the nickname Coco. And the scholars are saying it's because it's a play on the word coquette, which in French is translated as kept woman or prostitute. She did have many benefactors through her life. I don't have enough time in this program to go through every one, but I picked some of the most important ones so you can sort of see how she progresses. 1908 to 1909, she becomes the mistress of a wealthy French heir, Balsam. 1909 to 1919, she becomes the mistress of Arthur Boy Chapelle. He's wealthier, and he's an English heir. And this one, remember, is the one that the scholars believe that she truly loved. This was the real love for her. 1920, she was the mistress of the Grand Duke Pavlik. He's a Russian royalty guy. 21, she was the mistress of Igor Stravinsky, a very well-known Russian musician. 1923 to 1929, she was the mistress of a Duke, Duke Grosvenor. He was the wealthiest man in Britain at the time. 1930 to 1935, she was the mistress of a French illustrator, Herbie. He's an artist and designer in the decorative arts. This one is probably the only other one she truly loved other than Boy Capel. And there was some strong belief that she would marry this man, but he dropped dead during a tennis match when she was just right there, and that ended that one. So more tragedy. And then 1941 to 1953, she is with Baron Hans Dinklage, and this is the man who nearly ruined her career. He was a Gestapo spy and a Nazi intelligence operative, not the sort of person she should have been hanging out with. Let's take a look at some of these now, the ones who are the most significant in terms of her getting the financing to build her business, but also for her to learn how to live and interact comfortably with the highest of society in Europe at the time. Etienne Balsan, he's the first one. He was an heir to a textile fortune, and he's the one who sets her up as a hat maker, a milliner in Paris in 1910. She was his second mistress. He moved Coco into his chateau, which was located just northeast of Paris. And Coco there discovered a leisurely and lavish lifestyle. Of course, she had only imagined. When she was a teen in the monastery, she would sneak in books, romances, and read them when the nuns weren't looking. And this was what her life suddenly was looking like. That second mistress business was when his first mistress would be on site at the chateau. Coco would have to eat with the servants and not be seen. And Coco didn't mind at all because it was the best life she'd ever had, and so it felt good. She learned here the joy of horseback riding, the joy of going to lavish dinners at night, wearing beautiful gowns and dresses that Balsan had given her with jewelry that he gave her. She got bored with it. And what's making her bored is her ambition. She wants to be an independent woman making her own money. So she starts designing hats, decorating hats. And all these socialites who come to Balsan's great chateau for these parties and things see her hats and they want them. You can tell, I mean, if you think back to what the monastery looked like and you look now at what Balsan's chateau looked like, it's very easy to see that she has landed on her feet, so to speak. For the first time in her life, she's in a social circle that she had hoped for, and now it's hers. And they know her, she knows them. She developed this cute habit of borrowing Balsan's clothes out of his closet to wear herself. And she did this with several of her lovers. And it's funny because if you watch those clothes that she chooses to borrow and then look later as she develops her fashion line, you see the influence that have come from these men's clothes. For Balsan, she borrowed a shirt of his, just a men's shirt with a knotted tie, a very simple man's hat. She wore his overcoats when it was cold, and she wore the little riding pants. This is at a time when if women were horseback riding, they were riding side saddle and they were wearing skirts. She puts on men's pants and goes riding and loves it. One of the people she met while she's at the chateau with Balsan is Arthur Edward Capel, nicknamed Boy Capel. And she fell head over heels in love with him, so she left her first lover to take her second lover. And we'll look at him. This is the fellow, I think, who had the greatest influence on Coco Chanel's worldview. He was aristocratic, English, polo-playing playboy, and playboy is an important word here because, like Balsan, Coco was not his only mistress at the time that they were together. He financed her expansion into clothing. Balsan had gotten her into the hat making area. She now wants to design clothes, and Boy Capel is the one who puts the money in for that. In 1919, she buys 31 Rue Cambon, which is today's location for the Chanel Enterprise, Maison de Chanel. It's still there. She bought it then. She borrowed money from Boy to be able to do that. And she moved to Paris into an apartment that was paid for by Boy. He financed her first real venture into the work with Balsan, the hat shop, and then later he solos to supply her with enough money to open the clothing store. Boy was a voracious reader, and that's the reason I think that he probably had more influence on her than any of the others, because the others, they didn't, see her necessarily as just a toy or something, but he recognized that she was very bright and that she had the capacity to learn. He was aware of her intelligence in a way perhaps some of the others had missed. He introduced Coco to classical literature. He read all the time. He made her read. He had a wonderful private library. And because of that, she became more aware. She became an educated woman, which was not so common back then. In 1919, Boy married an Englishwoman, an aristocrat with a proper background. So Coco loses him because she doesn't have the good name. She does have a growing business that's already becoming pretty popular, but he must marry into the aristocratic class because that's his class. A year later, Boy was killed in an automobile accident. And there was some thought that he was going to leave the English aristocrat and marry Coco after all. They had not stopped being lovers during the period after he got married. She was devastated, and she really never forgot him. And another thing with that curious logo that everybody recognized, those interlocking C's. Some have suggested that's for Chanel and Capel. We'll never know. In 1921, she extended her line to include those accessories, that jewelry I was talking about. And then in 1922 comes Chanel No. 5. Boy's gone. She's devastated, and she finds comfort in the arms of a Russian Grand Duke and the cousin of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, Dmitry Pavlovich. From Pavlovich, she learned about the Slavic Russian culture, and she learned the motifs that the Russians used. The camellia flower, for example, the double-headed eagle. She picked up on those images and she worked those into her jewelry. Particularly in the brooches that she did. Poor Russian Grand Duke Pavlovich was penniless, and he had also been suspected of being involved in the murder of Rasputin. So Coco kind of had to keep him. He was her lover for a change. When their affair ended, they still remained close friends for the rest of their lives. Pavlovich had escaped Russia when the Bolsheviks were murdered the Tsar. He gave Coco some of the Romanov pearls and gems that he had brought with him from Russia. He couldn't sell them, but he could give them, and he gave them to her. And her favorite was a 32-string pearl necklace. She loved pearls, and she loved to wear them in multiple ropes. So that was his influence on her. Next comes the second Duke of Westminster, Hugh Grosvenor. Coco met him in Monte Carlo in 1923, and he was at the time considered to be Britain's richest man, and he just happened to be very, very close friends with Winston Churchill. And because of her reading with Boy and learning something of history with Boy, she was delighted to meet Winston Churchill, which she did on a number of occasions. At the time she met this second Duke, he was married to his second wife. Their affair lasted about 10 years, during which time he gave Coco jewels and art and provided for her first real home in London. They spent a lot of their time at his fishing lodge in Scotland, the only known British property that Coco decorated. British tweeds, of course, we all know about them, but the fashion world for women didn't know about them. And Coco saw them, loved them, and so later her collections began to include some of the things, including the tweeds, that she had noticed on the hunting and fishing attire that the Duke wore when he went out and played in the Highlands. The Duke gave her lavish things because, after all, he's the wealthiest man in Britain. He gives her orchids that are grown in his own greenhouse, and he has them hand-delivered to her. In France, he's in England. Camellias, the same thing. He sends her fresh salmon on ice from his Scottish home so she could enjoy that. And one time, a favorite story, he sent her a box of fresh vegetables from his garden. And tucked in underneath the green vegetables was a little velvet box, and it had a huge rough-cut emerald sitting in the middle of it. Some historians argue that the Duke proposed to Coco several times, but that she refused him every time. Others say that he married his third wife because Coco was unable to give him an heir. Nobody knows for sure. And then there comes the disaster for her in terms of her reputation. Her timing was good for Coco. Her timing was not good for Coco's reputation. She meets Baron Hans Gunther von Dicklage, a German officer during the Nazi occupation of France and a member of the German High Command. He was a Gestapo spy and a major asset for the Nazi intelligence operation. Through him, Coco became friends with a wide social circle of the most powerful Nazis living in Paris at the Ritz. That's where she was living. Coco's nephew, Andre, one of the few family members that she ever admitted even knowing, she loved this kid. He happened to find himself in a German POW camp. Coco offered through the Baron to use her friendship and influence with Winston Churchill to help the Nazis broker a separate peace deal with England. And in that capacity, she acted as a Nazi emissary. In August of 1944, she was arrested on charges that she was spying or was in some way supporting the Nazi cause. She was never imprisoned for that. And several of the scholars argue, particularly those who are focused on the war history, they argue that it was Churchill who got her spared from that. But it shut down her career. She was staying at the Paris Ritz with Hans. She became addicted to morphine at this point. She was a chronic insomniac, and she had tried some prescription things, but found that morphine was just the thing for her. And for the rest of her life, she was a morphine addict. She now had a Nazi problem. She couldn't stay in France. She couldn't stay in Paris. She couldn't stay at the Paris Ritz, her favorite place in the world. So she did a self-exile to Switzerland. She had been on the top of the fashion universe by this time for 30 years. And now she just disappears. There is no more Chanel couture. She won't design again until 1954. When she's 71 years old, she comes back to France and she has her first show. Years later, she was asked which side she had been on during the war, after all, and Coco said, neither side, of course. Nobody's ever told Coco Chanel what to think. Just as Boy had introduced her to good books and classic literature, these two fellows introduced her to fine music and art of the time. Both were very important influences on her outlook, her life, and her decisions. The first one, Stravinsky. He's a Russian composer, pianist, beautiful pianist, and conductor, one of the most important and influential composers of the 20th century, and he was a pivotal figure in the modernist music movement. She adored him. Remember, she had loved that singing in the choir at the orphanage. So music was always to her an important thing. The other fellow, Salvador Dali, Spanish surrealist. He's an artist known for his technique, his precision, and rather bizarre view of the world. His imagery is very interesting. Dali was pivotal in the development of modernist art. So these two people, you can see now she is cultured, she is educated, and she is learning to discern the different aspects of the culture as it's evolving around her in France. I think it's interesting. She's a bohemian. They are bohemians. And they put together this coterie, this society of people who get together and they think interesting thoughts. They have interesting, educated conversations. They love the arts. It must have been a very special time for her. Now that last question, did she have children? The answer, perhaps. Her sister, Julia Bertha Chanel, was born in 1882. She's 1 year older than Coco. And she died in 1910. And most believe that she committed suicide. She had one son, Andre Palas. He's the nephew that was always Coco's favorite, even when she wouldn't admit she had any living family members at all. Coco adopted Andre after her sister's death. She saw to it that he got a gentleman's education and then worked him, as you know now, to get him released from the German POW camp during the war, even though it meant the end of her career at that point. Some historians make a strong case that Andre was actually her out-of-wedlock child that was born during the time she was singing in the cabaret. Others argue it's just not possible. I wish I could give you an answer. I have no idea. The childhood that Coco had and then her teenage years that Coco had, those influenced her clothing designs. In the list, there was this interesting explanation about how those things interacted. It says, Chanel's childhood became fodder for her fashion. She invented, observed Time magazine in 1951, the poor look, creating a simple dress based on a sailor tricot, using ditch digger scarves, mechanics' shirts, and waitresses' uniforms as inspiration. She really did develop the look that we take for granted today. But it didn't exist when she started doing fashion. 1910, that's when she sort of breaks out with her hats, her millinery. And this is a 1910 Chanel hat. It's very elegant brim. It's designed to make the woman's face the star attraction, and it is. And it has some frou-frou on top, but again, the bulk of it is that black hat. Then these are Chanel dresses, the early ones, about 1917. And you look at this and you might think, oh, how quaint. My dears, let me remind you of what women were wearing when she's putting us in this. She's responsible for allowing the ankle to show. For the first time, women's dresses are going to get shorter. Now, Chanel didn't do the mini skirt, but if she'd lived long enough, she might have. She also shows here the jacket, the idea of a jacket with a skirt underneath. Now, these are very full skirts, and you see one of them is kind of in layers and so forth. But the very idea of a woman wearing a jacket with a skirt, that's revolutionary. She said, I was the same age as the new century, so it turned to me for its expression in clothing. What was needed was simplicity, comfort, neatness. Unwittingly, I offered all of that. True successes are destiny. She always felt that she was meant to do what she did. Take a look at these. Now, these are the things that were in style for women when Chanel hit the scene. 1883, the year she was born, this one on the far left, they're wearing heavy gloves, high necks, big hats, sort of stuff around their hips, but their waists are very tiny, and then long, long skirts. Then just a few years later, 1896, look at this one. This reminds me of The Wizard of Oz. I hope it does some of you too. See the tiny waist, the hips accentuated, the shoulders padded, long sleeves, hat with frou-frou, long, long skirts. And then 1900, here's a picture of the corset that the women had to put on to be able to get into those dresses. And you see what it does. It cinches the waist, it enhances the chest, and it enhances the rears. These were not comfortable, gentlemen. If you're looking at this and you're thinking, no. This was like torture. And Chanel absolutely rebelled against it. She decided that was not the way women were meant to do. She began the business with designing the hats, and then got enough money from Balson and then from Boy to be able to do clothing. And over her career, she introduced short skirts, female slacks. Women were not allowed to wear pants. She developed slacks. She introduced Scottish tweed in clothing and in jewelry. Some of her brooches are backed by tweed. She created round toe shoes, two-tone slingback shoes, beach pajamas, and then her little bag. She also put in women's clothing for the first time pockets. She was a chain smoker and she wanted to have a pocket where she could put her lipstick and her cigarette lighter. And she thought all women deserved that kind of freedom too. Perhaps more important for the long-term success of the Chanel style was the way she introduced ladies three-piece suits. They could be very casual suits or they could be very formal suits. They would be skirts, short to just below the knee, and then they would be worn with cardigan sweaters or with jackets. And those have become staples for women's professional wear. You see Chanel's tweed suit here. You've got a very simple look, but think back to what that looked like in the 1890s and at 1900, the way, see this, she doesn't have any cinched waist here. Now she's allowed to be free and to move and to be seen. She's not a doll anymore. She is her own woman in her own right. Show you that she introduced the female pants, the fact that slacks. This is her boy shirt, which was fashioned after a sailor's uniform shirt. And her pants, notice her hands are in what? Those pockets that she put in for the first time. This is a picture of her, and there are a lot of them, but this is one that shows her wearing her favorite boy clothes. These are ones that she's taken out of the closet and made for herself. And what she'll do is she will adapt these in her couture so that they become suitable for a woman's figure. They won't be oversized like this and look like, she's wearing somebody else's clothes. They will be tailored so they look like her clothes. Her most famous thing, of course, is the little black dress. This is a picture of her wearing it. Notice this time she has both cuff bracelets on. the left and the right. Remember I told you, she said when she wore two, or any woman wore one on each wrist, watch out, they were coming. She's got her multi-strands of pearls. She's got her hat, her earrings, and her cigarette, ever present. And there's a drawing from Vogue of what the little black dress looked like. They put it in, and Vogue did it in 1926, published this drawing and called it the Chanel Ford dress, like Ford cars. In other words, it's made for everyone, not for just the special or the elite. Vogue claimed that it would become a kind of uniform for all women of taste, and it did. It was very simple, it was very affordable, and it was comfortable. All that was important during the Depression. Before the 1920s, black was rarely worn except for a woman in mourning. Not anymore. Just 1 year after Boy's death, Chanel turned black into the color for women. She said one time, if I could find a color darker than black, I'd make my clothes out of that. She also said this, quote, if a woman is shabbily dressed, it's her dress that's noticed. But if she is impeccably dressed, it's she who is noticed. I love this picture. First of all, they catch her in a time when she's not really thinking she's going to have her picture made because the cigarette is there, and she rarely allowed herself to be photographed with it. And she's got a model, and the model's expression as she's being pinned into this dress that Coco is designing, the model looks as tired and outdone as I expect a model would be. Coco could stand and pin for 10 hours at a stretch, even when she was in her late 60s. What's interesting about this is that most people, I didn't, and I bet you didn't realize, she couldn't draw. She was never taught drawing, so she couldn't sketch her designs herself. She would have to take the fabric and pin it on her live models and keep adjusting and adjusting and adjusting until she had it just like she wanted it. She didn't like to sew. She had developed a pretty severe arthritis in her hands relatively early in her life. So she hired, the sewers anyway. So she would just use dozens and dozens and dozens of pins to get the garment just right. And then it was the model's problem to get out of it and the tailor's problem to sew it. Beginning in 1947, she signed an agreement to sell her perfumes in exchange for royalties, a percentage, worldwide sales. That was worth about $1 million a year then. Today, or at least, the latest time that I could find the figure, which was 2013, that was worth $10 million a year. So this is what put her in the serious high cotton amount of money. It was the perfume. Remember I told you earlier, fashions come and go, but the perfume had its own special place, and it's never been usurped. You may not think that especially you young ones, you may not think that you've ever seen a Chanel, an original Chanel garment. You have. In fact, all of us have, and those of us of a certain age or over will remember it in detail. Here's a picture of it. Coco's iconic tweed suit was a favorite of many fashionistas, including Jacqueline Kennedy, the First Lady. And this is her raspberry suit with the gray trim and the hat that was designed by Coco Chanel. And it was what she wore on the day that her husband was assassinated in Dallas. We saw it later that day when she was sworn with Johnson, when he was sworn in on the plane, and it's covered in, of course, her husband's blood. And we see it then when they arrive back to Washington with his coffin. She refused to take the suit off because she said she wanted them to see what they had done. I did not realize, I assumed that the suit was somewhere on display. It's not, and by the request of the Kennedy family, it will not be seen in public again until 2103. Coco said, "Aging is a state of mind. One must keep enthusiasm and curiosity." And I'll tell you, if you read these books, you'll know, like I know, she never lost her enthusiasm and she never lost her curiosity. She did, however, lose her life. Finally, the body just gave way. I expect that the morphine dependency contributed to that, but no one will really talk about that much, so I don't know. This is her tombstone, which she designed herself. Notice it is as simple in its way as her clothing was, and it just speaks of her. Center point is a simple line cross. And then her name, Gabrielle Chanel, no Coco here, and her birth and death dates. And then running across the top are 5. Of course they're going to be 5. It's Chanel. There are 5 lions, 5 Leos, her astrological sign. And they're sitting up there looking down on where her body would be. And it's almost as though they're bits of jewelry to decorate what's otherwise an incredibly simple tomb. She died when she was 88 years old. She died in her apartment at the Ritz in Paris. She died on January 20th, 1971, and she would have hated it. It was a Sunday, and that was her least favorite day of the week because it was the day when people were forced to not do anything. She's buried in Lausanne, Switzerland. Remember, she had that exile period in Switzerland, and she loved it, and so she chose to be buried there. And 2 weeks after she's dead, her final couture collection is shown in Paris. She had an estate with an estimated value of several billion francs, but it's not clear that that's entirely accurate. She had established a foundation called COGA for Coco and Gabrielle. And that foundation, she had put money in for decades to support starving artists, to help educate people who wanted to do things in the fine arts. And so that's where the bulk of it went. Some, though, went to her nephew, possibly son, Andre, and to his 2 daughters. My favorite quote of Coco's is, "I regret nothing in life but the things that I have not done." She was a mess, and a beautiful mess. I want to read you something from one of our books that I think you'll enjoy. That'll be a good summary of this program. This is from the Chanel coffee table book, as I put it. It's toward the end of the book. And it is with this portrait of her, which shows her just head and shoulders, and she's looking to the side at us. And it reads thus: "Coco's words are at least as immortal as her style. Ironic, blunt, and sometimes biting, they too have become legendary. They still dictate the rules about what a woman should and should not wear to be elegant and to avoid going unnoticed. Quote, fashion reflects the times in which we live. Even if when times are trivial, we prefer to forget it," close quote. She used to say, insisting that luxury is not wealth, but a lack of vulgarity. She was a genius in combining clothing and accessories and often repeated, quote, "A woman with good shoes is never ugly," close quote, as she encouraged women to start taking care of themselves, always. Quote, "I don't understand how a woman can leave the house without fixing herself up a little, if only out of politeness. And then you never know, maybe that's the day she has a date with destiny. And it's best to be as pretty as possible for destiny, close quote. It was difficult to disagree with her when she stated, quote, simplicity is the key to elegance, close quote. She was a feminist long before that term existed and was famous for her irony about the opposite sex. Quote, a man can wear whatever he wants. He'll always be a woman's accessory, close quote. Not only did she dress women like goddesses, she told them that to build their character, they needed to learn to use fashion, not endure fashion. Quote, if there's no woman inside the dress, a real woman, then the dress is useless, whatever it is. But perhaps her best aphorism, the one that describes her best, was, quote, in order to be irreplaceable, one must always be different. And she was. I hope you've enjoyed learning something about this incredible woman who had influence that exists even today. The next time you pull on a pair of slacks, ladies, palazzo or whatever kind, think about it. Without Chanel, you might not have those. And when you put on a nice, simple top with a cardigan sweater and a little skirt, that's her three-piece suit. You can dress it up in tweeds and fabulous wools and gorgeous fabrics and make it an evening suit with a beautiful coat and that short skirt, but it's still her three-piece suit. I hope you have enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed bringing it to you. Till next time, have a good day.
You'll never see on screen, not very pretty, but we sure know how to run things. Living in ruins of a palace within my dreams. And you know, we're on each other's team. We're on each other's team. And you know, we're on each other's team. Number 5, Chanel.